Imagine what it'd be like if we were really curious about each other.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Relational Spirituality, the weekly podcast of largerstory.com, the podcast that sees all relationships as spiritual and all spiritual formation as relational. Now, here's your host for this week, Karlene Cannon.
Hello, Larger Story family. Welcome to the Relational Spirituality Podcast, where we discuss what it means first to belong to God, and from that position to become all that He created you to be, so that you can confidently be known in a listening community of others who are also belonging and becoming. Thank you so much for listening. Today, I'm so grateful and excited that my daughter, Ivy Hill, is joining me for a conversation about what it means to be relationally formed and what that's been like for her growing up in our family and in a variety of different church settings. As you know, we are beginning our focus on Larry's book, Real Church. Does it exist and can I find it? And so we're going to be talking a little bit today about what our experiences of church have been as a family, what Ivy's experiences have been since she's gone off to college, and what we're looking for in church. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Ivy. She's the oldest of our 4 children. She's 25. She's married to Jimmy, which means we now have 5 children. And she lives in Memphis, Tennessee, where she teaches 9th grade physical science and biology at Kingsbury High School. She graduated from Duke University in 2020 and got married soon thereafter. So her experience of the COVID years were all wrapped up in the loss of sort of normal experiences of major life events like graduation and weddings. So she's got a lot to talk about from those experiences. While she lived in our home, she also had the privilege or burden of participating in a community group of between 20 to 80 people at any given time over the course of about 10 years that met in our home every week. And Ivy played a major role in this. She helped us with the kids who were younger than her, and she was kind of the pesky little sister to the kids who were older than her. Of course, she interacted with adults all the time, and this just still blows my mind. She even allowed a group of adults to meet in her bedroom when she was a teenager to have their conversations every week, which I just found very generous for a teenager. However, this wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Ivy was particularly known in our family for her formidable resistance to conversation. When she was 13, 14, 15, those years, she would sit on the stairs while her dad and I talked to her and say nothing for hours. So I am particularly grateful that we now, some years later, are on a podcast having a conversation. It's proof that that God is active and accomplishes miracles. But that's not the end of the story. Ivy went on to, in her college years, gather a group of 20 or more college students and really established a deep, close-knit, challenging community there their 4 years while they were in university. And they continue to interact at that deep level, even now that they're spread all over the country. So she has a lot that she can share with us about what it means to live in community. So Ivy, thank you so much for being willing to come and talk to me.
Yeah.
Given by a little bit of what I shared about where we started, I'm very grateful and very grateful for all that God has done to get us to this place. I never thought 10 years ago that we'd be on a podcast having a conversation. So is there anything you'd like to add? Did I forget anything? Or maybe you'd like to share your side of the story?
Well, I was just going to say, I didn't know I had an option to not have adults meet in my room. So wasn't really framed to me that way. So,
Well, I always thought you had an option. Or at least I thought you had the option of protesting, and you never
Mm.
did. So I really appreciated that. Well, let me start by asking you kind of what that was like for you growing up in our house, where not only your dad and I were asking you questions and engaging in deep conversation, but other people were here, and there was always that kind of risky, uh, probing conversation that was happening around you, and moving and people moving toward you in a curious way. What was it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I guess it's weird because it all started, I feel like when dad and you started kind of getting into all that material and stuff was right around when I was like 12, 13. And so I guess I did know something different, but I think I didn't really also have a concept of anything other than that.
Mm,
So to me, it felt kind of normal
yeah.
ish. Maybe not for you and dad to ask me questions, but for other adults to ask me questions. I think I was someone who always was quick to speak, and in class I was always the one who was going to talk if no one else was going to, and I was the one leading conversation. So I think there was part of me as a 12, 13, 14-year old who was grateful that adults were pursuing me and like wanting to know what I thought, and like I guess just communicating to me that my feelings were important, and like my desires and all of those things were important. Like as someone who teaches 13 and 14-year-olds now, I think a lot of kids at that age just they're kind of just told like shut up, be quiet, do what you're supposed to do your work.
Yeah.
And no one really asks them, why are you acting that way? Why are you doing these things? And so I think if I look back on it now, especially as an educator who works with 13 and 14-year-olds like all the time, I think that it was really valuable for me to have so many adults in my life who were pursuing my heart and getting underneath my bad behavior. Or in my case, most of the time it was good behavior, and still probing underneath that, because I think it would have been really easy for me to get to be a 20-year-old and think, "Oh, I don't struggle with anything because
Yeah.
all my behavior is good."
Right.
And so I think for me being engaged like that at such a young age really helped me in my understanding of who I was, but also in the way I related to others, and not just seeing people as either, oh, well behaved or poorly behaved
Mhm.
people. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I really liked what you talking about there, where you chose early on that the path to life, if you will, was to be good, be smart, get it right,
yeah.
cooperate, please the adults in your life. And so it would have been probably a common experience for someone who chose that path to almost be overlooked because, the squeaky
Yeah.
wheel gets the grease and there's no reason to, Ivy's doing fine on her own. We don't need to really get underneath what's going on. Um, and so then that's almost a form of neglect. And also I think and you sort of alluded to this, it's conveying that sin is primarily behavioral, and as long as I behave, then I'm good. I don't really need much from God. And so what was it that, and obviously as we, talked with other adults and talked with you guys and other teenagers, like we were kind of probing underneath that and trying to communicate that sin is relational. And you also watched your father and I relate in ways that were sinful, that were damaging to each other and to you guys. So you certainly had that, and you had three little brothers, and there were lots of, you know,
Yes.
challenging relational situations that came along. So how did you experience that idea of relational sin and relational holiness that Larry talks about in the context of community, and how was that sort of brought into your awareness, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I think that when I was middle school, high school age, I think my understanding of it was mainly probably with my brothers, maybe a little bit with friends, but mainly with my brothers of like, as the older sister and they're much younger than me. So 5, 7, and 11 years younger. So I feel like I like somewhat rightfully felt, much different than them most of the time and felt like I knew better than them, which was probably true some of the time. I was still 13, but still a 13-year-old has a little bit more street smarts than an 8-year-old. And so I think that um it would have been really easy for me to just think, "Oh, you know, I'm in charge." And I think a refrain I heard a lot as a kid from you and dad was that I was not, the deputy mom and that I could not, act so I was not that person. And so I think that I kind of internalized that while I had something to offer my brothers for sure, I also the way I did it was important and like, what I communicated when I did it was important, and, like, being kind and all of that was important, and, I think that was a lesson learned over many years, through a variety of things, but I do think that I learned that, like, I could sin against them and, not necessarily like, yeah, jumping off whatever insert random object here was a bad idea, but me, like, screaming at them and telling they were stupid was also, like, not the right way to handle it. And so I think that kind of taught me that while, like, things aren't so black and white of just, just because you were doing it to keep them safe doesn't mean you have the right to belittle them while you're doing it? And so I think, like, learning to see those nuances through a lot of different ways was really helpful for me. And I think also like with my friends and stuff, I was able to see that like, I could care for my friends and do certain things, but also, it wasn't loving to them to not say anything if, you know, I don't know, they were doing something they shouldn't have been or whatever it was. And so I think I was able to learn a lot about how relating to people is messy and what one person experiences isn't necessarily what another person experiences. I think we talked about that a lot too when I was growing up was just like, okay, well, I didn't think I said anything mean, but they experienced it and they were hurt by what I said. And so whether my intention was to hurt that person or not, it's still what I said was hurtful. And so I have to deal with that and decide like, is that something I need to apologize for? Or is that something that like we need to settle in some way? And until we settle that, then the relationship, there's some kind of brokenness there. And so I think I was able to kind of internalize that, through all of those things.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying. The way Larry talks about this is like, do you ever ask people what your impact is on them? And
Hmm.
that without that kind of self-awareness and that um, courage to ask someone how you really impact them, there's a lot that God wants to do in that revelation of what you just said. I might not have intended this to happen a certain way, but it is how I impacted you. And I need to take ownership of that and deal with that. I think that then makes the need for the Holy Spirit that much greater because I can kind of control how I behave, but I don't have, and I can control the things I say, but I don't necessarily have control on how that impacts you. And usually, if I go another layer down, there's something happening in me that is driving that insensitivity. Um, whether it's a subtle negative impact or a more overt one. So
Yeah.
that's a really good point. I like that. Um, so how does that help you? You mentioned your work with your students, and you deal with. Gosh, I think you told me like your largest class is like 35 or 40 kids. And how many
Yep.
students do you deal with in the course of a whole day?
Yeah, I have 210 kids on my roster.
Okay, so that's a lot of relating. with a
Yeah.
lot of variability. And I know you have children
Yeah.
who speak all kinds of languages and some who speak very little English. And so lots of different challenges in relating. But how does these ideas and this way of maybe communicating a little bit deeper, how does that impact your teaching and your relating with all of these students?
Yeah, I think that for me, I think it starts with just the base assumption that every kid comes into my class with like a whole life. Like they have things going on at home, they have friendships, they have, so many things happen throughout their day before they get to me in fifth period at 12 p.m. And so that their actions don't necessarily like have to do directly with what I've seen, like if they are choosing not to follow my instructions or choosing to talk to their friend or on their phone, um, you know, the things that add up in a day when there's 35 kids doing it all the time. I think the base assumption is just that, it's probably not about me. It might be about me, but a lot of the times it's not. And I think giving kids the benefit of the doubt is super important, and that's something we talk a lot about in like the program that I did for teacher preparedness. Also just when you relate and see people for not only their behavior, but also like what's happening emotionally, what's happening at all these different levels of their heart,
Mhm.
then you can come into it and see that, okay, them being disrespectful in this moment isn't necessarily because of something that I did or a response to me, but is because of something that's going on in their heart. And I get to choose my response to that. And especially as the adult in this space and one of the only emotionally regulated people, that is on me to emotionally regulate myself when they're still learning how to emotionally regulate themselves and set up a space that will be most successful for them to not only learn but to also thrive and know what's going on with themselves. And so I think for me that impacts a lot of how I set up my classroom. Like, you know, I allow students to like take a break if they need it and, you know, have 5 minutes to get themselves together and then come back. I also like try really hard. I don't do this perfectly, but try really hard if I am going to discipline them, if there is something happening, to take it out in the hallway and not do it in front of their peers. Because I do think, especially for 14 and 15-year-olds, like most of what's happening is to impress or
Yeah.
make someone think something about them. And so if I can take them out in the hallway and talk to them about it, a lot of times I'll get underneath of like, oh, so and so said this to me at lunch and now I'm upset about it. And so that's why I did this thing and, whatever. And so I think just, coming from that assumption and like seeing kids as whole humans, it's something that's really hard to do when there's 35 of them and one of me. And I don't have time to do that perfectly all the time. But I think when I can and to the best of my abilities, like putting that into my routines and procedures in my class and like what kids know they can and can't do and why, um, just helps them to learn how to do those things. And kind of narrating too, like for myself, I mean, literally today, my seventh period made me very upset. And I told them, I said, I'm getting very frustrated with y'all right now. And it makes me want to yell at you. I don't want to yell at you though, because I know like it's not all of you in here that's making me frustrated. So I'm going to take a minute and I need you all to take a minute and think about like, what can we do to make this day go better? Because if it goes like this, I'm just telling you, like, I am going to yell at you at some point. So I think also just learning that it's okay to be a person myself in the midst of that too.
Gosh, there's so much I could respond to in there in what you just said that honestly delights my heart to hear you articulate some of these things. I loved what came out to me is that, if we're aware that God is not focused on our behavioral sin, but on our relational sin, we should extend that same grace to other people and not just judge their behavior, but take the time to be curious and get underneath what's going on in them as a whole person. Like that's what Jesus would do. I really liked that. I liked the self-awareness that you have and the willingness to be vulnerable and what a great model that is for these kids who may not have another adult in their life that ever says, I'm about to make a mistake here, or I just made a mistake here, or I'm about to behave in a way that I don't want to, that actually models for them how to not only emotionally regulate, but how to relate well and honestly. Um, so there's a lot there in what you just said that I really appreciate. And what I think the question I was left with was, so, you have some recollection of being the 13, 14, 15-year-old who was, you know, impacted by adults struggling with these things.
Mhm.
Probably a whole array of things, certainly from me and your dad, good, bad, and ugly. But now you're the adult being able to offer something. I think that's probably pretty rare to most of your students. They probably don't experience that kind of thing a lot. What's that like for you to kind of be now the adult in the room, modeling and pursuing these kids as much as you can, given the limitations of your situation?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think it's a big reason I wanted to become a teacher. I think that's like part of why I felt called to this profession and why I felt like and why I think I find it very engaging and energizing is I'm like 97% on the extrovert scale. So I just enjoy relating to people. And I do come home exhausted some days, many days. 200 people is a lot to relate to in a day, but I think that it's still something that really like feeds me and really like uses my strengths well and challenges me every day. There's not a day that goes by where I don't have to kind of think about it. Like today, on my car ride home, I had to kind of talk myself off the ledge because they really made me mad today. And I had to just kind of process, like, okay, why am I feeling what I'm feeling? How can I like it's not about them. How can I just release it? And the things that they did that made me upset, like, okay, I just need to release that. And like, how do I do that in a healthy way? And so I think for me it's really a use of a lot of the skills that I have been honing and that you and dad and Larry's materials and my friends in college all kind of help me gain different perspectives and really learn what it means to relate to a very vast array of people. Um, and just be okay with the fact that I'm not going to do it perfectly all the time. I think that was something that like relating to people in college and relating in community and just being okay with saying I'm sorry. Like I'm sorry. I assumed this about what was happening and I was wrong.
Right.
And I'm sorry that I hurt you when I made that assumption. And so I think just like learning how to do that. I mean, in teaching it happens so fast, like, I'm doing that 100 times in a class period, but I think that it's something that on good days I find really energizing, and on bad days I think reminds me of my need for God and his grace and, you know,
Yeah.
his energy.
Yeah. Again, lots of things I could respond to, but one thing I want to jump into a little bit is you mentioned how, and I think all of us can just imagine the sort of rapid fire relating that you have to do with 210 teenagers crossing your path, and probably then a myriad of other administrators and teacher, all sorts of things, and how, you don't have the time to sit and reflect and be intentional. Like you're reacting out of who
Mhm.
you've become. And you talked about your community in college, and of course, we've alluded to community before you went to college, but how that was a place where you were able to develop and form so that in this rapid fire kind of relating that you're doing now, you've got
Mhm.
some wherewithal, you've got some pattern skills, just good habits, I guess. Can we talk a little bit about that community in college? And first of all, what you were thinking, what you kind of went to college in with the goals of community in mind, and then how that played out both I want to be like really positive about your community because it's one of the things that Dad and I are most thankful for is the group that you built and formed and helped to form in college. But then it was messy. It is messy. As you said, relationships are messy. So, can you talk a little bit about that and maybe what that formation was like for you?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think as a 18-year-old going to college, I was coming from, I mean, that was like peak community group. So that was when community group was like 70 people every week. And, you know, lots of people, and I was also a senior in high school. And so I feel like senior year is just when you kind of rule everything. And so I was just used to being the one who organized everything and, you know, a lot of relationships ran through and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think when I went to college, I just really desired to meet people and be intentional and form a community there of people who, you know, had different experiences than me, but also who, were all Christian and that kind of thing. And so when I went to Duke, the interesting thing about Duke is I feel like there's not a ton of Christians on campus in the same way like state schools or especially schools in the South have. And so most of the people in like community or Christian organizations are pretty committed to their faith. And so I think I immediately found some people like first week of school, my roommate included, who were very like-minded to me and also just like, I don't know, we were all in I think 18 to 22, you're just like finding out who you are, separating from, your family and kind of processing what happened to you for the first 18 years of your life when you're in a new place and things are different than what you're used to. And so I think that we were just able to have a lot of really intentional conversations. As an 18-year-old, I had a lot of energy for sitting around in a circle and everyone talking about their life and things like that. And I think because of Larry's materials, I was equipped with a lot of types of questions and how to probe at, people's stories and be curious about more than just, you know, where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? What are you studying? And ask more deep questions about family and about feelings and about desires and those kind of things. And so I think because of some of those like trainings that I had in high school, uh, it allowed me to facilitate some of those conversations that might not have happened otherwise. I think also there was just a really unique group of people that God brought together who are really willing to engage deeply with themselves and with other people and be curious about themselves and other people and give a whole lot of grace to everyone because we were a bunch of 18-year-olds asking each other about really like for some people really traumatic experiences, and none of us were licensed therapists or anything like that. And most of the people in the group have since gone to therapy, but we're not going to therapy as 18-year-olds. And so I think there was a lot of messy relating and all of that. But I think everyone in our group was really starved to be known and to know other people. And so I think in that desire, we were able to just connect and in the season of being in college, we had a lot of time to devote to doing that and to knowing each other and to knowing ourselves. And and so I think that was really special. Um and like you and dad, we were able to like go on some retreats and like learn about some of Larry's materials and get more training on things like that. And so I think through all of those different both materials but also just time for conversations that mattered all the time. All like when I think back, I'm like, wow, how are we not literally so exhausted? We were talking about so much all the time. Something was always happening with someone, um, which was really fun. It was a really cool season of life. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, it gives me a lot to think about. But I think the phrase that stood out to me was you said we were starved to know and be known. And I think that's the human condition. I think we all start there and keep getting back to that place, right? As life happens. And I think or I don't know, maybe it's just me. Like I feel that, but I assume everybody else is doing all right and they don't feel that same hunger or starvation. And so you mentioned just the ever present curiosity that continued to energize your pursuit of people. That's one thing that I really admire about you, Ivy, is you pursue people and you're not looking for a lot in return. Like you're willing to keep pursuing, even though you're not getting a lot of response, particularly people who are struggling in just and are using isolation sort of help themselves through the struggle. So I just watched you pursue hurting people a lot and with this sort of indefatigable energy. Like it never runs out. And I so admire that because I text someone 3 or 4 times and that's kind of about the extent of what I have to offer. So that's just a special gift that you have that I think God supplies the energy for. Um, but I also think it's kind of driven by a curiosity, something Larry would have called like a sacred or a holy curiosity that God puts in your heart for somebody. And I agree with what you said that God sort of sovereignly assembled your group of friends in college. But I think a lot of that happened because of this curiosity that was in your heart and others in your group to keep pulling people in. And so now that you're out of college and you don't have that same kind of environment that's so conducive to conversation and where you're all just proximate to each other and it's easy to find each other, like what have been the struggles and how do you maintain that curiosity as you move into new communities and new seasons where it just structurally is gonna function differently, and you have a different set of challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I feel like we've talked about with my friends from college and then also talked to some of our new friends here in Memphis. Um, but it's really challenging to find that again. I don't know how people I don't know how people move all the time and like restart on community. And just like being in your like mid to late 20s is just a tiring time because I feel like everyone just transitions a bunch, especially like specifically college educated people. Like you go to grad school or you go to a program or you do this and then a lot of people move back home or they do, multiple things in different places. And so it's also just really hard to find a community that stays and like people that stay when you don't have college where it's like you're stuck there for 4 years. And so I think like Jimmy and my husband has the blessing of, having our teacher program, which is a 4-year program. So we kind of are stuck with these people here for 4 years. And so I think that's a big reason I wanted to do this program was because I was like, look, people who I can count on for 4 years again. And there is something really refreshing to that. I mean, I was just talking to 2 of my friends here that were like, oh yeah, our whole community group is moving next week. And all the friends I made are gone now because these are the relationships I've invested in the last 2 years, and now they all moved in 1 week. So now I've got to start over. And I think that's just a common experience.
Yeah.
Even if you don't move, like everyone else is kind of moving in young adult groups and churches and stuff. And so it's really hard to pin people down to be in community. And I think like once people have kids and get a little older, people tend to settle more. But I think this stage specifically feels really challenging to like commit to. And I'm a very commit person. Like I think I've watched like I think just growing up in a space where we were just in a space for a really long time and with people for a really long time, like in my head, time is the thing that, you know, builds those and allows you to know someone deeply and allows you to do life with them. And at some point, you have to commit to that, or else you won't ever find true community. Because if you're constantly moving around for all this stuff, you're not going to be able to plant anywhere. And so I think for me, at least, it feels like a choice of like, I want to be here and be present. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'll be here forever, but asking people to commit to, okay, what does this look like to be in community together where we are right now and in the season we're in right now and all of that. And so those are conversations that I feel like we are now being able to have with friends in Memphis. Like we are almost at year 2 in Memphis. And we actually this Sunday started, yeah, I haven't told you this yet. We started a small group for our other teacher friends. So there's like 10 of us meeting like bi-weekly, and we're gonna like have dinner. So me and Jimmy are making dinner, and then we're gonna talk about a subject or like something. We're still figuring it out. But try to do a community and just like talk about, okay, let's be intentional and like incorporate intentional time where we see and check in with each other. And so I think that's something that's like, even for me as someone who's is really has a lot of energy and curiosity around people, it feels harder with a bigger group, but I think it's really important. And so just like seeing how can we start that in the small places and incorporate that in. But yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that with me. I feel kind of like a grandmother, because you're starting your own community group in your own house. That's kind of a cool thing.
I know,
Um,
it's so fun. I literally said that. I was like, "Wow, it feels full circle right now."
that's really fantastic. I look forward to hearing how that goes and just seeing what God does with your willingness to offer and invite. I think that's beautiful. So that's really cool. Well, I wanted to just sort of transition this conversation a little bit more focused from community and Christian community to church, because I think when we start talking about church, that's a loaded word, especially in our current cultural moment. A
Yeah.
lot of people have had, church hurt. They've been hurt at church from individuals or organizations. We've certainly experienced that. Um, so I first want to just ask you to share a little bit about your experience at church growing up. And, we had a few blips along that road, and then you found a great church in college. And then I know you have the whole experience of finding a church in Memphis again. And, it's not an easy thing to do. So I just wanted to first kind of let you share a little bit about what church has meant to you, and then maybe close with just a couple of questions about what you're looking for in church at this stage of your life.
Yeah, for sure. Um, well, if I were to summarize church, I feel like over my whole life, I feel like it's felt always like a place. I mean, I think it depends. So I think growing up like K-8, we went to one like pretty large church, and I kind of liked it, but I don't think I ever really felt super connected there. I think there were people that I felt connected to, but I think it was never really like my place. I think when I went to high school, we went to a smaller church, and I think that was where I really felt like known and like I got to know other people, and I really loved that church and really loved the people in that church. And at the end of high school, there's a lot of drama in that church, and that resulted in a break that I think was pretty painful for me and pretty confusing for me. And
Yeah.
um, I don't know how much you want to get into it, but I think it resulted in a lot of the like leaders of that church rejecting you and dad. And I was like 18, 17 or 18 at that point, and I think I felt very slighted because no one ever had any conversation with me, and I felt like I was an adult practically at that point, and I was very integrated into the church. And because of all that happened with y'all, I just kind of got outed too, right as I was transitioning to college. And so it kind of happened the summer before I went to college, and so then when I went to college and came back, I didn't come back to the church that had been my church home and had I think was really, really, really positive for me
Sure.
all of high school. And I think that was really confusing. It was a weird way to end because it coincided with my transition.
Yeah.
And so I think it was a wound that definitely followed me into college. And then as I was trying to find a church in college, I think I just had a lot of fear around church leadership specifically and elders and men specifically who were supposed to be safe that didn't really feel safe and didn't really feel like they had the best interests of their congregants at heart. And so trusting new men that I didn't know, I think felt really challenging for me. And I think in college, I found a really awesome church, but I also think in college, I wasn't really, because I had a Christian ministry, I think I received, like, I really went to church on Sunday morning,
Yeah.
but I was not really a part of the church outside of that. I think most of my, like, quote unquote church was at college, not so much at church.
Yeah.
And so I think I wasn't really forced to deal with a lot of that until I graduated and then continue going to that church for a year, which was good. But I think I just struggled to find community there and really plug in beyond Sunday morning and kind of knowing some people. And then I think in Memphis, Jimmy and I have kind of had a similar experience, and it was COVID. So then there was the whole like no one's going to church
Yeah.
and what even. And I think that just made us reevaluate like what's the point of church? Why
Right.
do we go to church? Like why are we doing this? And then especially becoming a teacher also, like, I don't know, sitting there listening to someone talk for 50 minutes is just not the most efficacious way to learn anything. So like, what's the point of going? Why are we doing this? And so I think a lot of those questions were kind of coming up for us in the COVID season. And when it was just hard to go to church and awkward and felt weird. Um and so then when we moved to Memphis in 2021, I think finding a church, we went to two churches that had some of our friends from the teacher program that we were in our master's program. But they just didn't really feel, I don't know. I think there's a couple of different reasons, but we just kind of hopped around for a little bit. And now we found a church that we really like and are working on becoming members of. But I think even still, it feels really challenging as someone who's married but doesn't have kids yet to plug in because it feels like the people who are really involved generally all have kids. Like, at a similar stage of life that I just think until you are at that stage of life, it's hard to connect to. And it's hard to connect to people who are older than you because the pace of life is very different. And so I think church just feels difficult to trust and difficult to invest in when there are other options for Christian community, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, having shared some of your experiences that you described in high school, I also share some of your feelings about that and about church. And then you're right, COVID sort of, upended everything. And I think created a lot of questions about why are we doing this way? Why are we, what are we really looking for in church? What do we really need from church? And so, and I think your particular season of life is a place where most churches, I don't think, really have a lot to offer. I remember being at your stage of life um, and really not finding a good place to land in several churches. And we finally, God just, put people in our lives who we still are in community, are, still relate to even today, 30 years later. But given all of that, and maybe thinking outside the box a little bit, what could church be? What would a church offer that would draw you in this particular stage of life?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. That's something I've talked to some of my friends about. I think I think there's a mix of things. I think church for me, like what I'm looking for is I mean, I think it comes back to like knowing and being known. Like, I think that is something that you should be able to find in church, is like a place where you are known and where you get to know other people. I think also like being challenged in my faith and in like my experience. I think transitioning to adulthood as a 25-year-old, there is just a lot of change and a lot of like things. And so I think church is a really cool opportunity for multi-generational community in that, and like connecting with people who have, been there. And I think can speak into like what God is doing in this season of my life. Um, but I also think that church, like, and specifically, like, I don't know, I feel like church, we usually think of like Sunday morning. And I think Sunday morning, like, teaching is supposed to, communicate and remind you of the truth and remind you of who God is and who He is, like, in your context and relating to you. Um, and I think it's hard. This is something I've thought about a lot, is like, if a pastor, if like their way of preaching or their way of teaching or whatever doesn't speak to me, like, is that a reason to go or not go to a church? Or if I, don't necessarily agree theologically with everything, is that a reason or not a reason? Or these types of things. And I think that's something that's really challenging to put my finger on, of like how to make those decisions. And um and I think that also, like, church is more than just Sunday morning, and I think getting into that is important, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there are any easy answers. Um,
Yeah.
and there's all sorts of reasons why we make these decisions about where we go to church. Um, and I don't think you're at all alone. I don't even think this is peculiar to your season of life. Like, I think we're all sort of wrestling with different aspects of what you just described. Um, if you had to articulate, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, so just, do what you can. Offer what you feel willing to offer. If you had to articulate what your ideal church would be, or some aspects of your ideal church, what just first comes to mind?
Hmm. I think for me, it would be a place where I think where we could like be open with where we are at and where we are coming into it, and where people, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me is just like knowing people there. And I think that's hard to do without time. But I think just walking in and feeling safe and at home and at peace, and, you know, a place where it's safe to not be okay, and it's a safe to need one thing one week and a different thing the next week, and to ask for that and to offer that to other people. And I think, you know, also just, I don't know, creating space to commune with God, and like in what that looks like for different people, and challenging each other to do that. I think, I don't know, that's a hard question. I don't know that I can fully answer that. I think it's easier to say what I don't
Yeah.
like in church than it is to say what I would want in a church. I think it's hard for me to imagine like a bigger church being that, I think I've kind of figured out for myself that I really like a smaller place where it feels, you know,
Yeah.
I'm able to like know everyone in the room, or most people, personally. But I think, yeah. And also I think just like, I think I've learned about myself recently that I really don't like a pastor who just gets up there and tells me what to think. That is something that really bothers me. I want to be thinking in church. If I'm not thinking and I'm just writing notes, then I probably didn't commune with God at all.
Mm.
And I didn't actually like learn anything from that, except for that I need to adhere to a certain way of acting. And that's something my personality is already prone to. So I think, a place where I'm challenged and leave thinking and want to talk about it with people afterwards and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I'd, love to hear your list of what you don't want at some point as well. But I think what struck me about the things you were describing, and I know I just sort of put you on the spot, but everything you talked about was relational. Like, you didn't talk about the worship music. You didn't talk about the order of service or, do we do this or that? And, um, which I think a lot of people spend a lot of time, um, focused on. And I think those relational characteristics and aspects that you described, are what we are all hungry for and wanting from church. And sometimes we find that in these other pockets of Christian community. But there's something about, and you talked about this earlier, about that commitment that goes with being a part of a church that sort of stabilizes and, you know, strengthens the community. It's hard to do that without church. So,
Yeah.
gosh, I think that gives me a lot to think about. And we're almost out of time. So I'd love to keep talking if we could at some point. But thank you so much for giving me your time. I know you just finished and it sounds like it was a particularly difficult day. So I am very grateful that you would find the energy and the internal peace to be able to engage with me in this conversation. I'm super proud of you and think so highly of you and Jimmy and are so grateful for what God has done with you and through you. And I look forward to hearing more about your community group. That's really awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you've enjoyed our conversation. I pray that you guys can find a community just like we're looking for, where you can practice relational spirituality, where you're constantly reminded, just like Ivy said, you're constantly reminded that you belong to God. And that as a result, you can become who He made you to be because of the infinite source of His love. And that enables you to be known, what we're all starving for, to be known and to know. So thank you, Ivy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time.
If you like what you heard today, hit the like button just below. Then come back by subscribing to our podcast channel. For more resources on relational spirituality, go to our website at largerstory.com.